Cities are built on connections. They are places where people come together to work, play, make art, build community, and so much more. Cars and public transit both promise to connect people, but too often they both fall short on that promise. In a car, you can travel directly from point A to point B in a comfortable, private cabin, but there's not nearly enough room for everyone to drive in dense, lively cities, so cars lead to congestion and frustration, not freedom. Transit makes much better use of space, but it is often run by an unresponsive public monopoly, it serves only some kinds of journeys, and it can be enormously expensive to operate. This video is about a different way. Using principles we already know about cities, transportation, and economics, it describes a framework for how autonomous vehicles can use cities' existing infrastructure to provide the kind of mobility that people deserve. As any well-versed transportation nerd will tell you, autonomous technology alone cannot solve the geometric fact that there is not enough space in cities for people to always travel alone in a car. In fact, there is a future in which autonomous vehicles make traffic congestion even worse because people will be more willing to put up with delays if they can sit in comfort while their vehicle drives itself. But that future relies on one thing: free roads. The future I describe here is one in which private vehicles have to pay for the road space they use, with every segment of every major road priced to carry as many vehicles as possible without getting congested. Rather than pricing people off of the road, this would price people onto it. Someone driving alone would have to pay the entire toll themselves, while 30 people on a minibus could split the toll 30 ways. The higher the tolls, the more people would economize on space. While few people like the sound of a toll, without a monetary price, we still pay to use busy roads. We pay not with money, but with time we spend sitting in traffic. And while you can split tolls, you can't split time. If a road is free and open access, people on a bus or in a carpool will spend just as much time in traffic as people driving alone, even though those people are each taking up a lot more space. With properly priced roads, more people can travel and they can travel faster. And after the system's expenses are covered, the rest of the money could be given back to every local resident as a cash dividend. This framework would allow autonomous vehicles to replace not only today's cars and buses, but also trains. Trains can carry a lot of people through a limited amount of space, but as I'll show, autonomous vehicles could carry even more, all while coming more often and reaching more destinations. Train tracks would be paved over, allowing autonomous vehicles to travel on any corridor, whether that was originally built as a railroad, as a subway, or as a highway. And from these high-speed, high-capacity lines, AVs could fan out on surface streets to reach every corner of a metropolitan area, making fast, affordable, and reliable mobility accessible to a greater degree than even the best transit systems have achieved. By making so much better use of space, this system could make it easier, and maybe even popular, to dedicate more street space to pedestrians and cyclists. Of course, this approach is not inevitable, and that is why it is so important. Autonomous vehicles will not serve us well unless we set up the rules to make them. At the time I'm releasing this video, autonomous vehicle technology is not yet developed enough to play a major role in how we get around. But it might be someday, and it's worth thinking about how it could best serve us in our cities. This is about delivering the freedom promised by cars and the accessibility promised by transit. It's about promoting connection, for a city that's better connected is better at being a city. And to illustrate how it all would work, I'm gonna explore the case of New York. From its inception, New York City has been shaped by transportation. Its early strength stemmed from New York Harbor, a natural port that made it a hub for maritime trade. With the opening of the Erie Canal, the city's location at the mouth of the Hudson River grew even more valuable, and it attracted more and more people. As the city grew, so did the number of horse-drawn carriages and omnibuses. 1827 saw the introduction of streetcars, horse-drawn carriages similar to omnibuses but running on steel rails embedded in the street. This simple change made them about twice as fast and a lot more comfortable than riding on cobblestones, and it allowed the city to expand northward as it saw massive waves of immigration in the ensuing decades. In 1837, the New York and Harlem Railroad started operating steam trains in the city. Steam trains were faster and cheaper to operate than omnibuses, but in 1854, the city banned the railroad from operating them south of 42nd Street because of an outcry over the smoke and cinders that flew into nearby houses. Then as now, there was a tension between new transportation technologies and the quality of the urban environment. And that tension would only grow. Steam trains returned to southern Manhattan in the late 1860s with the construction of the first elevated line. By 1880, there were 4 elevated lines, and passengers could ride as far north as Harlem. While putting the trains above street level made them safer and faster, their elevated structures darkened streets, amplified their noise, and failed to prevent air pollution. Still, the Ls were enormously popular, speeding up commutes and helping the growing city continue to expand. It was great to live near an elevated line, but less so to live next to one. In 1906, over 30 years after the first elevated train, the first subway opened to the public. With newer technology, express service in both directions simultaneously, and better construction, the subway offered faster service than the L's, and it did so without darkening streets and with dramatically less noise. While constructing subway lines could be very disruptive, once they were in place, they caused little commotion to the people above them. They made it easy to get through a neighborhood, easy to get to a neighborhood, and easy to enjoy that neighborhood. The subway system expanded throughout the 5 boroughs in the ensuing decades, and in the 1930s, the city took square aim at the L's, building subways near or directly under where the L's ran. While the L's had been electrified around the turn of the century, their noise and shadows were enough to convince real estate interests, city officials, and others that they ought to be removed. While some L's persist to this day in the outer boroughs, the final L in Manhattan, the 3rd Avenue line, was demolished in 1955. But all while the L's were coming down, the streets were only becoming louder and more chaotic. Cars came to New York City fast and without mercy. They were rare at the turn of the century, but around 1920 there were nearly 250,000 registered in the city, rising to 1 million around 1941. They clogged up the streets, spewed pollutants, roared with noise, and killed scores of pedestrians. They promised the ability to go directly from point to point in a fast, comfortable, private-controlled cabin on wheels, but there was not nearly enough room in the city to accommodate them all. As the number of cars grew, so did congestion. And this congestion affected not only private cars, but also streetcars and jitneys. By the time cars were gaining popularity, streetcar lines were electrified and ubiquitous. Jitneys, on the other hand, were much more ephemeral, and their history helps illustrate why transportation is the way it is today. Jitneys lie somewhere between a taxi and a bus. They offer affordable shared rides in private vehicles, often informally and on flexible routes. They exploded onto the scene in American cities in 1915, an improvised form of transit operated often by non-professional drivers who were unemployed or looking for a side hustle. Drivers might pick people up on their way to work, hunt for fares along a streetcar route, or simply drive around and choose their route based on where their first passenger wanted to go. They offered people an alternative to the streetcar and L monopolies and to private cars, which were too expensive for much of the city's population. Jitneys cost the same as streetcars, and they were often twice as fast and many times as frequent. They were unplanned and highly responsive to where people wanted to go. To be sure, jitneys had their issues. They were totally unregulated, and some operators would overload with passengers, skimp on maintenance, and drive recklessly. Still, they were a grassroots solution to challenges in urban mobility. They gave many unemployed workers a chance to earn some money, and they made much better use of space than private cars. I like to think there's an alternate history of New York in which jitneys were supported and properly regulated, where people had a choice beyond joining a flood of private cars or testing their luck on unreliable transit. However, in the 1910s, the streetcar operators had the power, and streetcar operators wanted jitneys gone. All across the United States, laws were passed that all but killed the jitney by the 1920s, and it would stay that way for decades to come. The dominance of the streetcar, however, was not to last. As congestion climbed year after year, instead of prioritizing shared vehicles, New York City and real-life supervillain Robert Moses decided to prioritize making more space for more vehicles. Roads were widened, sidewalks were narrowed, streetcar tracks were ripped from the streets. Massive new bridges and tunnels were built. Highways some 100 feet wide were cleaved through the urban fabric, displacing hundreds of thousands of people and subjecting those who remained to live in fractured neighborhoods beset by endless noise and pollution. These highways made it easier to get out of the city and harder to live in it. No one has described the destruction better than Robert Caro in his classic work, The Power Broker. Caro describes one destroyed neighborhood as such. Of the people who lived in East Tremont, who had found in that neighborhood security, roots, friendship, a community that provided an anchor, friends and synagogue and why, a place where you knew people and they knew you, where you could make a stand against the swirling, fearsome tides of life. Only the very old, too poor to move, still lived, almost barricaded in their freezing apartments. As for the rest of the people who had lived there, they were gone. New York had removed hundreds of loud, disruptive elevated trains and invited in millions of loud, disruptive cars. And the highways were worse than the L's. An elevated train might have 3 tracks, through which at least some light could reach the street below. But the highways that Moses built were hulking, solid masses of steel and concrete, and he plowed them through countless apartments and homes. Where the elevated trains served the neighborhoods along their routes, Moses's highways had widely spaced entrances and exits that left many communities in the dust. And where the L's were electrified around the turn of the 20th century, to this day, most cars still run on gasoline. And of course, all of this car infrastructure never solved the traffic problem. Within a couple years of opening, each new bridge, tunnel, and highway was as clogged with commuters as the routes it was meant to relieve. A single subway track can carry tens of thousands of passengers every hour, but a highway lane can only carry around 2,000 cars per hour. With cars carrying an average of 1.5 passengers, you'd need about 15 lanes to match the capacity of the most productive subway track. Jitneys were effectively outlawed, and buses were unpopular because they got stuck behind all of the cars, so the capacity of each lane remained low. And with millions of people moving throughout the region every day and that number only growing, it's no wonder that every new or widened highway failed to make a dent. When the highway building boom finally ended around 1970, it was not succeeded by a subway building boom. The MTA suffered from decades of deferred maintenance, and both it and the city were in a near constant state of financial crisis. With rising costs, the political challenges of raising the fare, and ineffective leadership, the authorities' paltry funds were spent covering day-to-day bills and staving off collapse. The highways built in decades prior had steadily siphoned away riders, including many of the middle to high-income people whose tax dollars the city depended on. Subway cars were covered in graffiti and constantly breaking down. Crime was rampant, ridership was plummeting, and in 1982 it reached its lowest level since 1917. The subway had been in various levels of crisis for decades, but this was much worse. It wasn't until the 1980s that the MTA's first ever capital program injected much needed cash for repairs, and a vigorous anti-graffiti effort began improving its public image. In the mid-1990s, crime began to turn around, and the city began a sustained period of growth in jobs, population, and subway ridership. The system has improved a lot, but it has improved on the back of enormous debt and ever-rising subsidies. And still, it has yet to reach a state of good repair and functions far less reliably than its international peers. Despite this, politicians and MTA leaders have decided to push through some expansion projects. These projects, such as a 3-station section of the 2nd Avenue subway, a 1-stop extension of the 7 train, and East Side access, have been enormously expensive and extravagantly delayed. But far more important than these megaprojects have been the changes to how people use New York City's streets. One way is through the massive expansion of cycling infrastructure. The city installed its first on-street protected bike lane, meaning one where there's a physical barrier between bikes and car traffic, in 2007. And by 2022, it had over 444 miles of protected bike lanes. CityBike, the city's bike share system, is over a decade old now and has grown to incorporate more docks and a mix of classic and electric bikes. Like cars, bikes let you travel exactly when and where you want to go, but without causing so much pollution, so much noise, or so many injuries and deaths. Of course, protected bike lanes are only found on a small fraction of the city's streets, and many New Yorkers do not feel safe biking even when there are protected lanes, in part because cars still block them and their protection does not extend into intersections. In 2022, bikes made up only about 2% of travel in the city. While bikes cannot come close to matching the capacity of subways, they could become a much larger part of the city's transportation landscape if the streets get safer. New York is nothing if not a walking city, and it has done a lot to improve the pedestrian experience in recent years, including eliminating or restricting car access to large swaths of Broadway, expanding sidewalks, adding curb extensions, and allowing roadside dining to replace parking spaces. As with cycling, these changes have not come to most of the city's streets, but where they have come, they've made walking safer and more enjoyable. Uber and Lyft came to New York in 2011 and 2012 respectively, simultaneously making it easier to get a ride and easier to get caught in traffic. They let people hail rides from their phones, know their fare ahead of time, and get rides in parts of the city where taxis are seldom found. Their success is clear. These services carried approximately 671,000 people per day in June of 2024, 5 times as many as yellow taxis. They've grown so popular, in fact, that as of 2019, they made up nearly 30% of traffic in Manhattan south of 96th Street. The easier it is for people to travel in cars, the more people will travel in cars. And though other factors are also at play, traffic in Manhattan has gotten even worse since these services arrived. Both Uber and Lyft have tried offering shared rides where 2 or 3 passengers ride together, but the response has been mixed. Many people have complained that shared rides are meandering and the savings underwhelming. And since these vehicles spend a lot of time empty in between fares and often replace transit, bicycle, and walking trips, they may make traffic even worse. Both companies suspended shared rides during the pandemic. Lyft has since given up on the idea altogether, and Uber has resumed but provides less than 10,000 shared trips per day in New York City, less than a tenth of what it did in its heyday in 2018. Thus far, Silicon Valley has failed to make shared rides work sustainably on a wide scale. But dollar vans have not. Dollar vans are the jitney reborn, a grassroots form of transportation that emerged during the transit strike of 1980 and has stuck around ever since. During that strike, people offered rides in their own cars and vans while subway and bus service was halted. The typical fare, $1. That fare has grown, but the principle is the same. Dollar vans, each capable of carrying a dozen passengers or more, carry tens of thousands of commuters throughout the city every day, providing fast, cheap, and frequent service. They span 4 boroughs and parts of New Jersey. They're an informal system organized by members of local communities with their ear to the ground for where people want to go. There are no big companies or big investors, and there is no government support. And yet, when buses and trains are too slow, too unreliable, or missing altogether, dollar vans fill the gap. Their routes, their frequency, and their stops are constantly evolving based on passenger demand, just as jitneys did decades earlier. And despite not receiving $1 of subsidy and dealing with the hardships of operating illegally, these vans are a vital resource that locals often choose over publicly run transit. Dollar vans, and jitneys generally, are one key way of understanding how shared AVs could transform urban transportation. Another is the Lincoln Tunnel exclusive bus lane, a 2.5-mile stretch of highway where buses heading from New Jersey to Manhattan get their own lane totally separated from cars. It began operating in 1970 with an upfront cost of just $700,000, or $6 million in 2024 dollars, and it added an entire train line's worth of inbound capacity in the Lincoln Tunnel. There are currently plans to add a similar amount of capacity across the Hudson River by building new rail tunnels, expanding Penn Station, and upgrading other infrastructure. Altogether, this would cost at least $28 billion to build, over 4,000 times as much as the bus lane. New York does not need any new highways, subways, or railroads to drastically improve its transportation network. It can do so simply by making better use of what it already has. There's no reason that the 6-lane Lincoln Tunnel could not accommodate 2 full-time bus lanes in addition to the existing part-time lane. Doing so wouldn't even require any new space in the Port Authority bus terminal. The additional buses could simply load and unload passengers using curb space in Manhattan that's currently reserved for car parking. People still driving through the tunnel would likely see their journey times remain constant or decrease after many of their fellow commuters switch to buses. The same treatment could be applied to the Holland Tunnel, the Queens Midtown Tunnel, the Triborough Bridge, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, the Long Island Expressway, and more. The city could in tandem create more busways on its arterial streets. And if private buses and jitneys could use this network too, commuters would no longer be beholden to the MTA, the Port Authority, or New Jersey Transit, and millions of people would have access to faster, more reliable transportation. Buses are not inherently a slower form of transportation than trains. They are only slower when they don't get the same priority. Nearly all of New York's trains fly under, over, or straight through intersections, are totally separated from cars, and have limited stops. Give these benefits to buses and they will travel just as quick. Not only that, but buses can reach just about anywhere with a paved road, while trains can only run where the rails are. Over 100 different companies and dozens of routes feed into the Lincoln Tunnel's bus lane, but NJ Transit runs only 6 train routes into Penn Station. So why shouldn't we rip out the train tracks, put down pavement, and let buses run where trains do now? It's not always a bad idea, but there are some major challenges. You'd have to shut down each line for some period of time while it's being converted, and since transit is so important in New York, that would be very disruptive. For buses to achieve the same capacity they do in the Lincoln Tunnel, they need space to pull out of the flow of traffic to make stops, space that train lines don't always have. It would also be hard for drivers to navigate the sharp turns and narrow tunnels found in much of the subway network. Any bus running underground would have to be fully electric, and even then, ventilation improvements might be needed because of the added heat and residue produced by vehicles' rubber tires. Of course, even if these challenges were overcome, labor costs would be a major issue. While busways don't need as many people to maintain them as railroads, they typically need more onboard staff per passenger. A typical New York City subway train is designed to carry around 1,100 to 1,500 people with just 2 staff on board, a driver and a conductor. A city bus can carry about 85 people, 115 if it's articulated, and it requires 1 driver. So at best, New York City buses need nearly 5 times as many onboard staff per passenger as a subway train. And that matters a lot. By some estimates, the driver's wage and benefits tend to account for about 70% of the cost of running a bus. That's not to say that converting a train line to a busway is never worth it, just that the higher onboard labor cost is a major downside. And there are ways to reduce that cost. When train lines are running below capacity, you don't need as many buses to replace them. You can also run fewer buses to the outlying parts of a corridor where less capacity is needed. You can also get bigger buses. There are buses in other cities that can carry well over 200 passengers each. Of course, there are many subway systems like New York's whose trains have just 1 staff member on board who both drives the train and operates the doors. There are even fully driverless trains, including 2 in the New York area, the Newark and JFK Air trains. Plenty of other cities have more. Paris has 3 driverless metro lines. Vancouver has a whole driverless system, and it offers frequent, reliable service all day long. If trains don't need drivers, then it's hard for buses to compete. Unless buses don't need drivers. If buses don't need drivers, it's cheap to operate frequent service all day long. If buses don't need drivers, they don't all have to be the same size. They could be like jitneys, blurring the line between transit and taxi. They could thrive just about anywhere, no matter how dense or how sprawling. They could safely operate in narrow subway tunnels. They could justify the costs of converting train lines to roads. They could make it so much easier not to own a car. If buses don't need drivers, the economics of transportation are turned on their head. If buses don't need drivers, they can do even more for cities, because cities are built on connections. That is some of how New York transportation has become what it is today. Now, I'm going to explore how it could be. To do this, I'm going to show how autonomous vehicles operating in the right framework could transform the commutes of 5 hypothetical New Yorkers. We'll start with Jake, who lives in Flushing, a neighborhood in eastern Queens, and works at the Barnes & Noble bookstore near Union Square in Manhattan. Jake commutes to work in the late morning and works until shortly after the store closes. He has a number of options for getting there, but none is very convenient. Most days, Jake walks 15 minutes to catch the 7 train from Flushing Main Street and then transfers to the N train at Queensboro Plaza, which he takes to 14th Street Union Square. The 12-mile commute takes Jake about an hour when the trains are running well. Jake occasionally takes the Q25 bus to the subway, but that bus is slow and infrequent, so it's often just as fast to walk. He could also take an express bus into Midtown and transfer to the 6 train to get to Union Square, but that would cost him $64 a week, nearly double the $34 a week he pays for local buses in the subway. And besides, express buses get caught in car traffic all the time. In theory, Jake could drive, but the cost of owning a car, paying tolls, paying for parking, and sitting in traffic is just way too high. In a world with autonomous vehicles and priced roads, Jake reliably commutes to work in about 26 minutes for an affordable fare and with no transfers. He enters his destination into an app and is given a menu of options for rides from over a dozen different companies. It's like kayak.com or hotels.com, but for everyday transportation. The government requires that all operators have open APIs, meaning that they are bookable through any third-party app for no additional charge. Together with laws making it easy for people to start an AV taxi/bus service, banning AV manufacturers and software providers from operating their own taxi or bus operations, and preventing operators from getting too big or colluding on prices, it ensures that Jake always has plenty of good choices for getting around. Services are decentralized, competitive, and responsive. Jake's most expensive options are for private rides, but there are affordable shared rides available in vehicles ranging from 4-seat sedans to 50-seat buses. The price is getting cheaper as the vehicles get larger. One particular morning, Jake chooses a shared ride on a 15-seat van with 2 to 3 intermediate stops, an estimated ride time of 18 to 20 minutes, and 7 minutes of walking. It's with an AV operator he's ridden with many times before and trusts well. The cost is similar to what he used to pay to ride the subway, and it's covered by his transportation dividend. Jake heads out and walks for 4 minutes to a pickup location near the Whitestone Expressway, a former eyesore that has now been put mostly underground, covered with parks and mixed-use development. A minute later, his minibus pulls up. The minibus is represented in blue in this animation. It gets on the Whitestone Expressway and connects to an AV highway called the Port Washington Line, formerly a branch of the Long Island Railroad. The AV highway is the same size it was when it was a train line, with just 1 lane of travel in each direction. The AV makes 2 stops along the route, each time ramping down to street level to pick up passengers before ramping back up to continue on its way. The AV switches to the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, or BQE, which has also been buried beneath parks and housing. It then connects to the Canarsie Line, today's L train, heads under the East River, and pops back above ground on 14th Street in Manhattan. It drops Jake and 2 others off at the southern end of Union Square and then continues on its route. Jake takes a pleasant 3-minute walk through the square to the Barnes & Noble. To make this journey via subway, Jake had to budget 90 minutes, including a 30-minute buffer in case of delays. Now he can safely budget 35 minutes and almost never needs that much time. No longer does he worry about subway delays or highway traffic. The Department of Transportation handles road pricing, and AV operators take care of finding the most efficient routes. Jake just chooses a ride. Sometimes Jake shares a ride with 5 people, sometimes with 30. Sometimes at night, the roads are cheap enough that he takes a private ride home. No matter what, he gets to and from work quickly, reliably, affordably, and safely. Chris lives in Bushwick, a neighborhood in northern Brooklyn. They work remote but travel to visit their parents on Staten Island most Sundays. As Chris will tell you, these trips to Staten Island are the reason they have a car. While they're able to get most of their errands done in the neighborhood and take the long but tolerable ride on the subway to get to Manhattan, getting to their parents' house without a car is an absolute slog. They either have to walk 18 minutes and catch the L train to Manhattan to catch an express bus to Staten Island, which only comes every 20 minutes, or walk 10 minutes to the J train, take that to Manhattan, walk another 10 minutes to the Staten Island ferry, ride the Staten Island Railway, and then walk another 17 minutes to their parents' home. Either way, the journey takes about 2 hours on a good day, and there's no way to avoid going through Manhattan, which is busy and out of the way from where Chris needs to go. So, Chris drives. If traffic cooperates, it takes them about an hour. If traffic doesn't, it can take them an hour 40. Either way, it's quicker than transit and it's a lot more comfortable. And since they've kept the car registered under their dad's name, they pay the Staten Island resident toll rate of just $2.75 each way to go over the Verrazano Bridge. Owning a car is a hassle, but to Chris, it's easily worth it for these trips. But with autonomous vehicles, Chris doesn't need a car anymore. Like Jake, they simply open up an app on their phone, enter their destination, and choose what ride they'd like. On one particular Sunday afternoon, there are plenty of private rides available for less than what it used to cost them to drive. But they see they can save a bit by opting for a shared ride with one intermediate stop. So, Chris takes a 5-minute walk to their pickup location. Somebody is already in the front row of the car, so Chris takes a seat in the back. They browse their phone as the car heads east on the Jamaica line, formerly the J&Z trains, before switching to the Crescent line, a former freight rail corridor that was at one time to host the light rail Interborough Express. The car drops off the other passenger before connecting to the Gowanus Expressway, the Verrazano Bridge, and what used to be the Staten Island Railway. It exits near Chris's parents' house and then drops them right at the door. They spend the afternoon playing tug-of-war with their dog Roxy, cleaning dog fur out of their parents' autonomous Cadillac, and reluctantly discussing football at the dinner table. After dinner, Chris requests a ride home, this time opting for a private car, since it's dirt cheap at this time on a Sunday. Just a nominal fee to cover the road's wear and tear. Chris relaxes as a small 2-seat car ferries them back to their apartment in Bushwick. Chris always hated having to drive home at night, but the strict regulations on AV safety and the technology companies have developed have made crashes a rarity at any time of day. Now, Chris gets to recline their seat, close their eyes, and listen to a podcast that has nothing to do with football. Anna lives in Kips Bay and commutes to her job as a member of the ensemble at the Metropolitan Opera. Her journey is entirely within Manhattan and is just 3 miles long, but there's no good way to make it. Most days, Anna walks to the 6 train, takes that to Grand Central, transfers to the S, takes that to Times Square, and then transfers to the 1 to 66th Street Lincoln Center. All in all, the journey takes her about half an hour. She could walk a bit longer and save herself one of those transfers, but she's chronically at risk of being late. When she first moved into her apartment, she thought she'd take a city bike most days, as Google Maps said it would only take her about 22 minutes. But after just 1 week of battling against cars in Midtown and a close call with a delivery truck, she decided to stop. What Anna loves most about the age of AVs in New York City is not the vehicles themselves, but the fact that she finally feels safe enough to bike. Now for her commute, she grabs a city bike and heads west on 32nd Street, which, like Broadway, some avenues, and all minor streets in Manhattan, bans motor vehicle through traffic, has vehicles parked on just one side of the street, if at all, has a motor vehicle speed limit of just 5 miles per hour, and allows bikes to travel both ways. Anna rides west until she hits Broadway, which she takes straight up to Lincoln Center. The avenues she crosses all have 15-mile-per-hour speed limits and just 2 lanes for cars, buses, and trucks, and the AVs are a lot safer drivers than humans. So Anna now has the luxury of commuting on a bike without once fearing for her life. Nor does she fear for her lungs, since over 99% of vehicles in the city are electric, or her ears, as the slow speeds keep traffic noise to a minimum. Midtown Manhattan still feels busy, but it doesn't feel noisy. Anna had long been in favor of any and all efforts to make New York's streets safer for pedestrians and cyclists. It used to be a fight to get anything to change, but when AV technology allowed through traffic to move to the subway tunnels, the idea of reclaiming streets from cars went from being contentious to being widely demanded. Of course, on days when it's bitter cold or pouring rain, Anna doesn't have to bike, so she usually takes a bus. On her way home, she sometimes stops at the bodega to grab a 2-pack of brown sugar cinnamon Pop-Tarts. She remembers the day early in the AV era when her bodega guy told her how much cheaper it was to restock the store. That was the day the price of her Pop-Tarts dropped by 50 cents. One day while working as a low-level accountant in the financial district, Eli gets a call from a friend who offers him a job at a company he works for out on Long Island. The job is better, the pay is better, and Eli knows he'd be a great fit. Google Maps tells Eli that the drive from his home in Bayonne, New Jersey to Port Washington at rush hour could be anywhere from an hour and 50 minutes to 2 hours and 30. And since his wife uses their car to get to her job, he'd have to buy another to get to his. Transit would be even worse. The quickest route, according to City Mapper, would require him to take a bus to the A train to the Long Island Railroad to another bus. It would take around 2.5 hours, and that's assuming everything is running on time. And because each leg of his journey would require its own fare, commuting 5 days a week would cost him over $600 a month. The job sounds great, but it's not worth that. Eli and his family all want to stay in their neighborhood, so moving is out of the question, and unfortunately the company does not offer remote work. So Eli doesn't take the job and continues working in Manhattan. In a world with AVs, Eli takes the new job, and his commute is consistently under an hour. On a typical day, he walks 5 minutes and gets picked up next to the Hudson West line. He gets on an autonomous bus with 30 seats, its interior resembling business class on a domestic flight. While he's riding, he puts his laptop on the tray in front of him and starts answering some emails so he can leave work earlier that evening. The bus takes the path to the 6th Avenue line, makes 2 stops in Manhattan, and then continues out into Queens, making 1 more stop at the new Sunnyside Yards development. From there, it takes the main line to the Long Island Expressway before ramping off and stopping about 4 miles into Nassau County. There's a little single-seat autonomous car waiting at the stop to ferry him the last 3 miles to his office park in Port Washington. The ride takes a fraction of the time and is a fraction of the headache of driving or riding traditional transit. And for Eli's ride home, he is delighted that he can have a little nap on the way and get home in time to go coach his kids' soccer team. Sean is an undergraduate at Fordham University and lives on the school's campus in the Bronx. One day a friend lets her know that some people are planning to head to Coney Island, which is home to a famous boardwalk, beach, and amusement park, and is located on the opposite side of New York City. The plan, and part of the novelty, is to take the D train all the way there, a ride of nearly 90 minutes. Sean has a disability that limits her mobility, so she's worried that if she goes, she'll make the journey more cumbersome. Her friend reassures her that everyone wants her to come and has no problem accommodating her, but Sean still feels a bit guilty that they have to. The station at Fordham Road is not accessible, so they'd have to take a bus to the nearest station that is. Plus, the way the platforms are designed, it's sometimes a bit hard for her to get on and off the train. And if they run into any out-of-service elevators, the trip will really have some headaches. Sean could take Access-a-Ride, the MTA's paratransit service, which provides transportation for people whose disability prevents their use of accessible mass transit, public bus, or subway service for some or all trips, but that would require her booking a pickup time at least 24 hours in advance and would only allow her to travel with one of her friends. The MTA has a pilot for on-demand service, but she wasn't selected for that, and besides, for an on-demand ride, the MTA would only cover around half the cost of a long journey like this one. In the end, Sean does go to Coney Island, and despite a couple long waits for the bus, the journey goes okay. She has a great time, and she's grateful to be a part of the trip. She just wishes she didn't have to think twice about it. And in a world with AVs, she doesn't. The only thing that changes when she joins the trip is that the group requests an accessible vehicle. That vehicle picks them up just as quickly as any other, and it doesn't cost them any more money. And since both pickup and drop-off are at street level, Sean doesn't have to worry about broken elevators. Instead of people heading up or down to meet vehicles, vehicles head up or down to meet people. The AV, a 15-seat minibus, takes a route that looks like this, and the ride takes 34 minutes. That's a dramatic improvement over the nearly 2 hours the same journey would take via bus and subway. But what's so much more important to Sean is that she gets to travel the same way everyone else does. Such equality on the subway has been promised for decades, but with AVs, it would be part of the system from day one. These cases show how this kind of framework could transform transportation in a city. Now, I'm going to take a deeper dive into how it all would work and what it all would mean. First, the system would provide the freedom promised by cars. New York once tried to build itself into being an automobile utopia, but all of its grand highways, bridges, and tunnels led mainly to congestion and the degradation of its urban fabric. But as the Lincoln Tunnel exclusive bus lane shows, highways themselves are not low capacity. Single-occupant cars are. Bus-only lanes are one solution, but pricing allows for a healthy mix of full-size buses, cars, and everything in between, allowing people to easily get rides even when they're traveling on a less busy route or at a less busy time. If every vehicle had to be a bus of a minimum size, some people's rides would cost more since they'd be riding on buses that aren't very full. And some operators might even try to game the system by intentionally running mostly empty buses for the comfort of wealthy riders. Responsive tolls would price people onto the road by incentivizing sharing. They'd allow for flexibility in terms of what shared vehicles look like, and they'd incentivize operators to fill their seats. Like I mentioned at the top, sharing saves people money on tolls. If the toll is $20 for a car, someone traveling alone has to pay the entire thing themselves. If the toll is $30 for a minibus, 30 passengers riding together could cover it with just $1 each. In a world with free roads, everyone's stuck in the same traffic, whether they're on that bus or in that car. And while prices can address congestion no matter what, autonomous vehicles make them so much more effective because they make it so much easier to share rides. To carpool today, you have to find other people traveling the same way and coordinate when you travel. You might have to go out of your way to pick someone up. You might have to leave earlier than you want. You might have to sit and wait for someone who's running late because you'd feel guilty for stranding them. It's enough of a headache that few people bother unless they live in the same home. Services like Uber and Lyft can shoulder the burden of coordination, but you have to spend a lot of money to compensate both them and their drivers. That cost, even if it's split between 2 or 3 people, will often outweigh the savings of splitting a toll. Jitneys and buses allow you to split tolls across more people, but they may need a lot of passengers in order to come out cheaper than driving, and there are only so many routes where they can get enough ridership to reach that point. AVs would allow people to share rides without the headaches of carpooling or the cost of paying drivers. Shared rides could make sense with as little as 2 people in each vehicle, so sharing could be practical even when demand is low. If you're matching 5 people every 2 minutes, services can be run to a lot more places than if you're matching 50 people every 20 minutes. The easier it is for people to share rides, the more people will share rides. The more people share rides, the lower the toll has to be in order to keep traffic moving, and the more people can travel. That's why AVs and pricing make each other so much more useful. Many streets today are the sites of endless little battles between people and cars trying to drive through a neighborhood and everyone else trying to enjoy that neighborhood. It's frustrating for drivers when they're stuck waiting at traffic light after traffic light, and navigating around pedestrians and cyclists makes that even more frustrating. But when the government bends to the will of those drivers and caters the landscape to their needs, it makes the environment a lot less pleasant and a lot less safe for everyone else. We end up with stroads, which like streets are trying to provide access to destinations along the way, and like roads are trying to funnel people between different areas. This is what a typical stroad looks like, but I'd argue that Manhattan's avenues, with scores of apartments and businesses on their sides but multiple lanes of fast-moving traffic running down them, are just stroads in a different form. But if subway lines are converted to AV lines, most traffic could zip beneath these avenues. Local traffic would still travel on the surface, but at far lower speeds, with fewer lanes and with higher tolls than in the tunnels below. Moreover, people wouldn't have to park long-term on these streets, as the vehicles they rode in could go serve more passengers or park in a remote location. Some vehicles might park temporarily on the streets so they can respond quickly to ride requests, but these need not take up anywhere near the space that parked cars do today, and their operators would pay for whatever space they do use. With AVs, there might not be so many people opposing improvements like extended sidewalks, bike lanes, outdoor dining, and public gardens. With the right setup, traffic would move underground and the streets would feel alive. AVs could offer mobility that goes beyond today's transit. They provide prompt service to every corner of a city and the surrounding area, even when demand is too low for frequent bus or train service to be economical. The MTA doesn't offer anything close to direct service between Bushwick and Staten Island, but AVs could take Chris on that journey anytime. AVs could also carry more people than subway lines. While trains can be massive, they also have to travel very far apart from each other. Buses can travel closer together, so much closer that they can more than make up for their smaller size. The Lincoln Tunnel today is dominated by coach buses, but the apples-to-apples comparison is subway buses to transit buses, which are both designed for a mix of seated and standing passengers. Transit buses can carry even more people than trains, even after the MTA's latest signaling upgrades are complete. A demonstration project by the Port Authority showed that it could increase capacity in the Lincoln Tunnel even more by automating buses' acceleration and braking, and future technology could boost it even further. Of course, capacity is not everything, and in practice, not all AVs would be large buses packed full of people. People could choose rides based on prices and their own preferences for cost, comfort, and convenience. And they could choose amongst many different companies offering rides, or even travel in their own AV. The MTA, NJ Transit and Company would no longer operate transit services. The roads, tunnels, and bridges that AVs run on would remain publicly owned and maintained, but the ride services would operate privately and, with the right regulations, competitively. If the MTA is routinely providing you bad service, you don't often have an easy alternative. But if an AV operator messes up even one time, you don't ever have to ride with them again. Just as you don't have to return to a hotel whose rooms are dirty, or a restaurant whose food gets you sick. AVs could stitch together the city's disparate transportation options. Eli wouldn't have to consider making 3 transfers and paying 4 separate fares just to commute out to a job on Long Island. A tourist wouldn't have to figure out what it means when the A train is running via the D from 59th Street Columbus Circle to West 4th Street. They could simply choose where they want to go and select a ride. With traditional transit, there's a tension between having more stops and faster speeds. New York City's local bus network is notorious for having stops that are extremely close together, averaging just 845 feet or 258 meters apart. This plays a major role in these buses being so slow. The problem with trying to reduce the number of stops is that people fight harder to preserve their stops than they do to eliminate others. In the end, the MTA's years-long bus network redesigns lead to only modest changes. On the other hand, New York's commuter rail networks typically have stops spaced a mile or more apart, even in dense urban neighborhoods. This lets them move relatively fast, but it also means that a lot of people near the line aren't within a close walk of a station. You can address the stop speed tension somewhat by having local and express services, but that requires spending more money or reducing service on each option. And with trains, you either have to sacrifice capacity or add new tracks. And even then, there's the issue of which stops get express service and which stops do not. Autonomous vehicles can be sized based on demand, not based on drivers. Each vehicle is much smaller than a train and can be much smaller than a full-size bus when it makes sense. And since each AV can pull over to make stops, the vehicles behind it can continue on without delay. With AVs, it's easier to group passengers more precisely based on where they're going and provide express service to all of them. AV service can also be a lot more resistant to delays. If a train stalls, all the trains behind it are stuck unless they can switch to another track. If they can switch tracks, there will often be delays as multiple services have to merge. If an AV lane is blocked, it's a lot easier for AVs to merge onto other lanes, to reverse the flow of some lanes, and to reroute AVs onto entirely different lines. The subway carries only people. New York's commuter rail lines either only carry people or just carry a little freight, as mixing the two can be a massive logistical headache. Trucks carrying everything from food to furniture are shut out entirely from this network, instead relying on expressways and surface streets. This slows them down significantly, and the costs of these delays are passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. It also means that people walking and biking through New York City have to navigate around huge delivery trucks and 18-wheelers barreling down their streets. But just as AVs can transform how people get around, they can transform how stuff gets around. When trucks don't need drivers, they're so much cheaper to operate, and they don't have to be so big in order to keep costs down. When trucks don't need drivers, they can run all day and they can run in subway tunnels. When trucks don't need drivers, they can be safer to pedestrians and cyclists while they're on the street completing deliveries. When trucks don't need drivers, everything they're carrying becomes more affordable. When trucks don't need drivers, the city can do more. AVs could allow people with disabilities to travel like everyone else and with everyone else. People needing door-to-door service could get it promptly, on demand, and at an affordable cost. And no one would be stranded because of a broken elevator. AVs and road pricing could dramatically improve emergency response times. Even when it's blaring its sirens, it can be hard for an ambulance, police car, or fire truck to get through gridlock traffic. Over the past decade, as traffic in New York City has worsened, it has taken over a minute longer on average for EMS to respond to life-threatening injuries, for NYPD to respond to critical emergencies, and for FDNY to respond to structural fires. In an emergency, a single minute can mean the difference between life and death. Letting emergency response vehicles travel on former train lines and on uncongested streets would save a lot of minutes. If implemented hand-in-hand with wide-scale electrification, AVs could dramatically reduce carbon emissions. The limitations of its transit means that even in New York, many people often drive, and less than 2% of vehicles registered in the city are electric. Electric autonomous vehicles would not all need to have large batteries, since most of them would not be used for long-distance travel. And since they could go charge themselves after dropping off people and goods, you wouldn't need to install chargers in as many locations. They could also save energy by filling more of their seats than modern transit. Outside of rush hour, trains and buses often have a lot of empty seats, since they're larger than demand requires, but still need to operate frequently enough to be useful to riders. Even at rush hour, they're only very full along a portion of their route. An A train coming from the far reaches of Queens only starts to get very full when it's nearing the Manhattan Central Business District, and once it's past that area, it empties out again. Since AVs can be so small, they can concentrate service when and where it's needed most without degrading service everywhere else. AVs would require expensive onboard sensors, computers, and software, but if vehicles enter mass production, these may prove much cheaper than the cost of hiring drivers. And while this system for AVs would require traffic signals and tolling infrastructure, it wouldn't require the expensive, maintenance-intensive network of tracks, switches, and signals required for the subways and commuter rail. Of course, a major downside would be tolls, which operators would pass down onto riders. Overall, how cheap AV rides would be and how often they'd be less than today's subway fare would not be truly knowable until the system were up and running, though it'd be fascinating and eventually necessary to see some simulations and analysis that would provide some estimates. No matter where AV fares would land, though, there's an easy way to ensure that everyone can use and benefit from the system. After paying to maintain transportation infrastructure, governments could put the remainder of the revenue from road pricing into a monthly dividend to local residents, the exact amount depending on factors such as where they live, their income, and whether they have a qualifying disability. With the dividend, people who use a lot of valuable road space, such as an executive heading downtown at rush hour in a private car, would effectively be paying everyone else for that privilege. Many people who mostly travel on buses, travel at less busy times, walk or bike would even receive more from the dividend than they spend on transportation, and they'd get to keep the balance. You could even supplement the dividend with the tax revenue currently going to transit agencies. The $9.4 billion in subsidies the MTA received in 2023 would come out to an average of $611 for every person living in its service area. With a competitive AV system, everyone would have the freedom to travel how they want, and the money earned from transportation infrastructure would give them the resources to do so. Transportation would no longer be publicly run, but it would do a far better job serving the public. Last, AVs could operate more safely than trains. Fatal derailments and collisions between trains are rare in New York City, but every year dozens of people are struck and killed by trains, and dozens more are injured. The 88 fatalities in 2022 compares to 120 fatalities from pedestrians struck by cars and trucks. That's certainly fewer, but it's not as large a gap as one might think. And while there's technology available to detect when people are on the tracks, it's not perfect and trains can't always stop in time anyway. AVs can stop more quickly because they're smaller, they use rubber tires, and they can react to obstacles in milliseconds. Of course, AV technology will only improve safety if it can reliably detect and respond to a myriad of potentially dangerous situations. As of this video's making, early results seem generally promising. AVs have already driven millions of miles across cities such as San Francisco, Phoenix, and Los Angeles, and the system I described would take years to begin operations, years during which the technology can further improve. However, these are still early stages, and I have no expertise on the underlying technology, so I can only say that AVs could be safer than trains and cars, not that they are or will be at any particular time. And to be clear, if they can't be safer, this whole system should not be implemented. Since there's still so much to learn about how safe AVs are and will be in the near future, it's worth discussing a simpler way for them to operate, in which they run only on former train lines and in special highway lanes, not on surface streets. This would make their job a lot easier because train lines and highways are already designed to remove most of the factors that make autonomous vehicle operations so complex. With very few exceptions, train lines in the New York metro area are totally separated from human-driven cars, pedestrians, and bicycles. They either run above or below street level, or they have a limited number of highly controlled crossings with warning lights and gates. On these corridors and on AV-only highway lanes, it would be easy to make sure that AV operators are made aware of any construction, that lane markings and road signs are clear and consistent, and that the route is kept free of any debris or hazards that could impede operations. In subway tunnels, even weather wouldn't be a concern. Mostly. So much of the work in developing safe AVs is in responding to edge cases, where something happens that the AV's software has never encountered. Limiting them to these corridors would make edge cases as rare as possible, dramatically lowering the likelihood that they'd get confused and pull over, or that they'd misjudge a situation and hurt someone. And even if this simplified system isn't necessary all the time, it could still be useful during extreme weather and emergencies, or simply if some surface streets are closed or too busy. And this could still dramatically improve service. On a former 2-track subway line, electric AVs could operate in caravans. These caravans could travel closer together than trains, so close that one caravan could be leaving a station as another is pulling in. There'd also be the ability for individual AVs to break off from caravans and onto different branches, avoiding the need for people to make some transfers. When demand is lower, service could be made just as frequent and vehicles just as full by shrinking the size of each caravan. On lines with 4 lanes, AVs could stop in the local lanes, allowing the express lanes in the middle to flow freely. People could access express service from every station without having to transfer, and journey times would be dramatically reduced, especially for longer trips. When tracks are stacked rather than side by side, AVs could just stay in the local or express lane until the next place for them to switch over. On lines with 3 lanes, AVs could also flow freely. Say some eastbound vehicles are stopped at a station. Other eastbound vehicles could pass them using the center lane, while westbound vehicles continue as normal in their side lane. Any westbound vehicles wanting to stop could queue up further up the line until the station clears and the flow is reversed. Like with 4-lane lines, everyone would have access to express service from every station. In this simplified version of the AV system, people would still have to walk, bike, or ride human-driven vehicles to and from stations. Full accessibility would still be reliant on stations having elevators and other features, and freight and local deliveries would still require human drivers. Some vehicles might have hybrid functionality, running autonomously on the AV network with a human taking over on surface streets, but these services would be much more expensive and wouldn't do as much in terms of safety. Also, capacity wouldn't be as high as when vehicles could ramp to surface level and make stops. Still, the transportation network would be a lot more connected, service would be faster and more prompt, people could choose between many different operators, and there'd be a lot of money to go toward the transportation dividend. Plus, this approach wouldn't require building so many ramps. I don't know whether this intermediate step would be necessary, but the perfect should not be the enemy of the good. Whether or not AVs will soon be ready for New York's roadways, I suspect they could soon be ready for its subways. This is the New York City subway. In most of Manhattan, the network is dense and well connected. In most of the outer boroughs, it's sparser, service is much less frequent, and most lines point toward the Manhattan core. Getting between the outer boroughs on this network can be a slog. Getting beyond the city's borders is not possible on this network alone. These are New York City's freight and passenger rail lines. I say lines rather than network because this is actually a picture of multiple different networks. There's one commuter rail network north of Manhattan, another on Long Island, another on Staten Island, and two in New Jersey, and they all require different fares. And even if taken as a whole, they leave wide swaths of the city untouched, requiring people to switch to the entirely separate bus and subway system to fill the gaps. Some lines on this map don't even carry passengers at all, they're just for freight. These are New York's highways. They directly connect the outer boroughs to each other and to the suburbs, and they do function as one network. Of course, that network is often choked with traffic. And within New York City, it can be sparse, as seen in Brooklyn on the right, and disconnected, as seen in Manhattan, just left of the middle. These gaps are filled by surface streets, but these too are often choked with traffic. But they need not be. These highways and their chief builder Robert Moses have long caused large parts of the city and region to suffer from chronic congestion and poor alternatives to driving. However, that's only the case if we imagine them only as conduits for cars. They can change easily and quickly if we reprioritize their space so that vans and buses could get priority, whether that's through mandate or price. Even the parkways that Moses intentionally built with bridges too low for buses can carry large passenger vans. It is not railroads that provide capacity or roads that cause congestion. It is how we choose to use them. And that, of all things, is not set in stone. Nor is how we use subway or commuter rail lines. Turning these from railroads to autonomous vehicle lines could allow all of the city's transportation corridors to function as one network, a network with fewer gaps and better connectivity, one where the fast pace of traffic does not disrupt the human pace of the city, one that everyone can access, one that's free of congestion, one that's easy to navigate, one that pays everyone dividends. One that can make the city more itself, more of a place for people to live, work, play, and learn together. And the same is possible in any city. The frustrations and disconnections of modern transportation detailed in this video are not unique to New York, nor are the benefits of AVs running on priced roads. The specifics described here will not apply perfectly to other places, but the principles remain. Even a city without any trains could benefit massively simply by making better use of its highways and roads. If autonomous vehicles can expand safely, they are likely to keep expanding, and it is crucial to ensure that they do so in a way that works for cities, not against them. Without this system or another intervention, autonomous vehicle technology could simply bring more congestion and noise to city streets, as empty vehicles go around and around waiting for their next pickup, and as people accept longer and longer delays since they don't have to pay attention to the road. That congestion is needless, and it is a far higher cost than any toll. Pricing the roads would bring order with little design. Leaving them free would bring chaos. Changes this big do not come quick or easy. In many ways, that's good. There'd be room for debate. There'd be room for ideas to bubble to the surface. Transit agencies could wind down through attrition and reassigning their employees, rather than laying people off due to no fault of their own. People could be heard and their feedback considered. The system could be rigorously tested for safety. And that brings me to a point worth repeating. If AVs cannot operate safely, and they cannot be secured completely against attempts to hack them, this system should not happen. Even a fairly small number of people dying due to flaws in the software is not acceptable, and a terrorist group being able to control and crash AVs on a large scale would be an unimaginable tragedy. Just as layer upon layer of safety regulations protect air travel, so too should layer upon layer of safety regulations protect autonomous vehicle travel. On the one hand, there is nothing new under the sun. I cobbled together a lot of existing ideas and principles when thinking of this system. The idea of charging for road space is not new, nor are the ideas of summoning rides on your phone, making better use of space through shared mobility, autonomous transit, electric buses, or private operators competing in the transit space. On the other hand, this system would transform urban transportation. The changes to how people live, work, and interact would be massive and admittedly unpredictable. I want this video to start conversations. There are many more things to say, many things I have missed, many things I've likely gotten wrong, and many things that can only be known once a system like this is already in motion. But it's worth dreaming of what can be, and it's worth betting on things that connect people.